First of all, I would like to remind about position of ultraviolet light. So what we have as ultraviolet light, we have our visible spectrum from red all the way to violet, visible spectrum, and ultraviolet light is on the border between the violet and other wavelengths which lie this side of the spectrum. And on the other side, just for reference, we have infrared light, which is next to red, but again, it extends to the opposite side of the spectrum. So in a way, when we talk about ultraviolet, we also need to keep in mind infrared because it will give us a better perspective of which level we are working on. So if you remember from Colourpuncture, we have this triangle, we have information, energy, matter. And ultraviolet light relates to a principle of information as opposite to infrared light, which relate to a principle of matter. Now, how does it translate? So infrared light we use for the body problems, for the pain, absolutely pain, this is primary application of infrared light. And ultraviolet is more reaching a spiritual dimension, reaching those very obscure, very vague, but very important realms where we must go sometimes, or very often, depending on the patient. If the situation is not clear, if we did a lot of spectral light, we probably did some soul spirit colors, we even probably did the grays, but something is still not resolving. Sometimes there is a known history, family history, or there is something that you feel pulling the patient somewhere, you don't quite understand where. Situation is very obscure, very unclear, and this is another application of ultraviolet light. So I feel this gives perspective. Talking about endocrine basic pattern, toxic basic pattern, and degenerative basic pattern, you remember that all disease starts with on a level of functional disturbances in the body, which is endocrine level, which is level of information, and which is level of spirit. And then if this is not addressed, if there is continuous stress and continuous functional disturbances, very often connected to stress, then we go into toxic basic pattern. So body is under so much pressure, then the pressure has to be released somehow. And very often we have acute situation which corresponds to toxic pattern, it corresponds to energy principle, and it corresponds to the soul. And if that gets unaddressed for a really, really long time, that can go further into degenerative basic pattern, which is end point of disease development. Not necessarily we have in tissue destroying diseases, although we might have, but sometimes this is just massive stagnation of qi and blood. And then basically from this point, we can easily develop any disease fairly quickly. So degenerative level is a level of matter and is a level of the body. So just keeping that in mind. And when we're talking about ultraviolet light, it really vibrates more in tune with endocrine basic pattern and soul spirit and soul information.